Welcome to everyone to another one of our security seminars. Hopefully where you are is warm and dry, at least here in the West Lafayette area. It is cold and icy, and I believe further down the East Coast, they've got quite a bit of snow on them. But we're warm and toasty inside here as we tune in with Zoom, and we are delighted to have as a speaker today Adam Shostak, who has an amazing record that goes back quite some time for things that he has done in the field of considerable importance. You can read a little bit of his bio on the webpage or find, I believe, must have a Wikipedia page. But I know some of the things that I appreciate that he's done are a couple of books. One, the New School of Information Security from several years ago was quite significant. And his recent, What Every Engineer Should Learn from Star Wars, it should be something that people should pick up. And there's a lot of other things that he's had a hand in. But today he's going to talk to us about risk. And I would like to remind the audience and the speaker, if you have questions, please do not post them in the chat. Post them in the Q&A. And at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button for Q&A. We'll use that for going through the questions at the end of the talk. So without further ado, again, thank you, Adam. Please take it away.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to share with you today, just by a little bit of context, is I was privileged to go speak at the Jet Propulsion Lab out in California late last fall, and I wanted to provide them with something that was thought-provoking. And so you're going to see some JPL examples here. You're going to see some space examples, because who doesn't love space robots, really? And, Spaff gave me a lovely introduction, and I'm sure Andrew, my co-author on the New School, appreciates the mention of that book. And in fact, I will mention that Spaff and I have a history that I attended the second workshop on vulnerability databases at Purdue many years ago, and that helped lead to the creation of the CVE. And so in addition, I'm a professor at the University of Washington, and I run a consulting company around threat modeling. And what I want to share with you today, what I want to talk about is I want to start at the engineering end of the world, is how do we build secure systems? What does that mean? Talk about threat modeling tools and techniques, one of the things that I am known for. And that will lead us to risk. And I think risk is fascinating. It's a tool, it's a framework. You can ask how we measure it. And throughout this talk, I'm going to talk about cybersecurity risk. And I'm just going to say risk for speed, but I'm not talking about other forms of risk, physical risk, what have you. And so, building secure systems, I am really focused on this question in my day-to-day work. How do we build systems that are more secure, that are more fit for purpose, that address the security challenges that they might face? And that brings us very quickly to an important question, which is, what does it mean for a system to be secure? If I have a goal like lift 1,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit, I can easily measure whether or not my system does that, and I can measure whether or not my system does that reliably. It's not a thing like 1,000 bits per second. In general, what we really mean when we say secure, or what we often mean when we say secure, is that it doesn't get hacked. And that brings up the question, is it not getting hacked because the defenders prepared themselves well? Or is it not getting hacked because of luck? I think we might agree that a system that isn't hacked by luck isn't really what we hope for when we talk about building secure systems. But it has this interesting property of being accidentally secure. And so there's some common definitions of security. One, and this is from NIST, one of the NIST standards, is security is a condition that results from the establishment and maintenance of protective measures that enable an organization to perform its missions or critical functions despite risks posed by threats to use of its systems. Another, sort of simpler but in the same vein, is protection against intentional subversion or forced failure. That's also a NIST definition. And then there are more commonplace definitions. Resilient in the face of attack, doesn't surprise its creator. And when we look at that first definition, which I read from NIST 853, I very quickly get to the question of what do I need to do? The definition says despite risks. What risks? Which threats matter? And I just want to comment that the use of threats here is about threat actors. There's other definitions, we'll get to those. And when I get to this question of what do I need to do, I get to the question of where's the list of things that I need to do so I can be complete? There's also a question of what is a mission for a business? And do cascade issues matter? If I can't get my incident response work done because Slack is down, because a botnet crashed DNS, is that insecure by this definition? I think it probably is, but it's we're very quickly into questions that I think are harder than they should be for how important we talk, or for how much importance we place on the idea of risk. That's what I meant to say. Now, these definition issues are not an excuse. We know insecurity when we see it. Aiken's law of spacecraft engineering apply to security. And if you haven't seen these, the URL is at the bottom. I'll be sharing these slides with you so you can go look them up. But they apply surprisingly well to security. And one of his laws is that design is based on requirements. There's no justification for designing something one bit better than the requirements dictate, which feels like hard-won engineering wisdom. But if that's the case, what do the requirements dictate as we're building a secure system? Our security requirements aren't crisp. They're not specific. They're not measurable. I don't know when I'm one bit better than what the requirements dictate when I'm building a security system or a system for a system which needs security properties. And so why is this hard? We lack a crisp definition of secure. We have lots of standards and rules to comply with, and compliance does help avoid insecurity, but there's a cost. And one of the things that I think is tremendously important is that standards lack any form of germ theory. And what I mean by this is a motivating principle or set of principles that allows us to say, we require that you wash your hands with soap and water for 30 seconds because that gets the germs off. And as a demonstrator of this is this question of, are most breaches caused by phishing or a lack of patching? I routinely hear one or the other, and when I ask people to raise their hands and we're in the room together, I get about 50-50. And I don't think that can be right, but I think we don't know. And I think that not knowing, the standards that we promulgate don't actually take a position. And because they don't take a position, we end up with a profusion of rules to comply with, and we often use risk to help us think about which ones we're going to comply with in a given set of circumstances. So my context here is I've spent over 25 years in application security. Um, I've been in industry, I've been a consultant, I've been a trainer. And one of the things I've found as we build secure systems is nothing is good enough is often the case. And what I mean by that is doing nothing is good enough. And I wrote an article a couple years ago in IEEE Security and Privacy magazine in which I argued that nothing is good enough is the way industry tends to think. And when nothing is good enough, we end up with a situation in which the lighter weight the methods that we bring to bear are, the easier they are to get adopted, the more likely they are to be used. And so I have this real focus on these very lightweight methods, not out of any disregard for the value that we can get from more formality, but from the difficulty of getting people to apply those methods in practice. And a lot of the work I do centers on threat modeling. And so what do I mean by that? Fundamentally, I mean using models to help us think about security. And threats meaning possible future problems. It threatened to snow today. And that's at odds with the definition of threats as threat actors. But hey, that's the English language for you. Complain to someone else, please. We can threat model TM to either systems we're producing, so something I'm building from scratch by writing software in, say, C or Rust or PHP. And we can threat model systems that we deploy that other people have built. And I think of threat modeling as the measure twice, cut once of security. It's work that we do to reduce rework, to reduce wasted effort, to reduce the need to fix it later. And there's a quote here from Frank Lloyd Wright, which is you can fix it on the drawing board with an eraser or on the job site with a sledgehammer. And by and large, it is way cheaper to fix it on the drawing board with an eraser than on the job site. But sometimes you actually need to fix it on the job site. And I mentioned that I had given a version of this talk at NASA, so there are some NASA jokes in here. So how do we do this? How do we threat model? I like to use the 4-question framework, which is to ask, what are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? And these 4 questions, lots of ways to answer these 4 questions, but these 4 questions allow us to think about different ways of anticipating problems that are appropriate to the system we're working on. You can read more about this framework, which I created at the threatmodelingmanifesto.org. And another value that we get from this, I'll talk about the scenario-specific ways of answering the questions, but we can appropriately align it to engineering processes. And this is so important. And for those of you who are students, those of you who are grad students, let me put that in context because I think this is really important. Every successful organization has a way of shipping products. And if I come in and I say, you ought to change the way you deliver stuff, people are going to look at me a little funny because they're successful. They've been delivering products in this way. And the more we can align with the way they're already delivering products, the easier it is for them to adopt threat modeling, the easier it is for them to start anticipating problems in ways that they can address. The other thing that we get from the 4-question framework is a common language. I have never been in a meeting where I've asked someone what can go wrong and they didn't have an answer. I have been in lots of, and that applies, by the way, from an intern all the way through to the CEO or the board of directors. always have answers once I assure them that I care about the answers that they have, not the answers that they think they should give me. And that's important because if we take advantage of everyone's perspective, if we bring diverse thinking to a problem, we're more likely to identify the problems that matter to the organization at a time when we have the most options as to what we might do about them. And so that common language, which is enabled by asking simple questions, is really important. One other part of threat modeling that I think is very important is threat modeling is the opportunity to identify and enhance boundaries. Boundaries give us isolation. This might be the boundary between, say, two user IDs on Unix. It might be a boundary between two VPCs in a cloud system, or even the boundary between two different cloud providers. Each of those boundaries reduces the capability that an attacker has to influence the thing on the far side of the boundary, and that's a really valuable security property. And it's even more valuable when the code at that boundary does a better job at enforcing or attenuating whatever it is the attacker might want to do, or even what a legitimate user might want to do. So, some ways to answer that question. We can answer the question, what are we working on, with whiteboard diagrams, with Lego models, with data flow diagrams. We can answer what can go wrong with brainstorming. We can use a mnemonic like STRIDE, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and expansion of authority. I do say that a lot. We can think about what can go wrong with kill chains. There are lots of methodologies available to structure the way we answer questions to give us consistency, which is great. And that leads us to what are we going to do about it? We can address problems by coding defensively. We can add barriers. We can add technical controls. And when those don't really work, we start to make trade-offs. We make trade-offs for usability or compatibility. We use risk management strategies like elimination of risk, acceptance of risk, or transfer. And we often want to use likelihood to help us prioritize. This thing is likely, or this thing would be high impact. We should do something about it. And this comes up so often when I'm training people, when I'm helping people do this work. What's the word I want to use here? They gravitate towards using risk-informed language to help them think about what are we going to do about it. And it turns out there are over 200 risk management standards, and there's a citation over there on the right to some work done by the UK's Research Institute in Socio-Technical Security. And NASA has a really mature approach. If you have not looked at the NASA Risk Management Handbook, it's actually really, really great. And I want to talk about this sentence. Before I do, I want to say that as a person who has written several books, it is trivial to go into someone's book and find a sentence you disagree with and nitpick. And that's not my goal here. What I think that this is the sort of statement that we often see in discussions of risk management. And so I'm not pulling it out to go, ha ha, NASA, what a bunch of fools or something. I'm pulling it out because I think this sort of statement is common. This statement, well, there will probably always be vigorous debate over the details of what comprises the best approach to managing risk. Few will disagree that effective risk management is critical to program and project success and affordability. And I broke the lines up there just for readability. And I want to ask some questions about this. I want to interrogate this statement. So the first thing I want to ask is, if we can't agree on how, right? There will probably always be vigorous debate. We can't agree on how. What are we agreeing to exactly? As I look at this, are we treating risk management as axiomatic, And if we are, what gives it that privilege? Why does it get to be treated as if it is an axiom? And then stepping past the what are we agreeing to and why are we agreeing to it, um, does it actually do what we hope it does? Are we improving project or program or mission success? And are the ways in which we're doing it affordable? And are they, to jump ahead a little bit, are they more affordable than other potential approaches? And so another article, and this was in Communications of the ACM last month. And again, I don't want to argue with the article, but I'm pulling out some quotes that were in two short paragraphs. And each of the sentences here is what I think of as a commonplace. It's a set of things that someone, as an author, they're writing these without expecting anyone to argue. They're using them as setup by saying the sort of commonplace things to which we all agree so that they can get to the points that are important to them. And it was simply a conveniently located set of quotes, but there are comments in here like, and these two sentences were adjacent. So systems that support operations carried out by humans and interact with other systems and organizations can never be 100% secure. As a result, a risk management approach must be taken to balance the mission of the organization and the cyber infra supporting with security controls and budget constraints. Okay. And compliance frameworks specify an agreed on set of activities and practices that manage risk to an acceptable level. And again, they put these forth as introductory statements. And as I read it, I just don't believe what they have to say, right? As a result, a risk management approach must be taken. I don't think that's a result of the preceding statement. I also don't think that it's a must, right? A risk management approach must be taken to balance the mission. Is that the only way to do it? And I'm pleased that Steve Lipner is here. Steve can see that I am quoting some work he did a while back with Butler Lampson on risk management and the cybersecurity of the US government, in which he argued against risk management and that we should have a small set of accessible, manageable activities that we can assess. But we can also think about this from the perspective of, does an RMA help find controls that work within budget constraints? I actually don't know a lot of risk management approaches that mention the budget that you're working with or how it gets divvied up. And so I'm not sure it actually does the thing that the authors were asserting that it does. And these, by the way, and here I'm talking about the NASA Risk Management Handbook, I'm talking about this particular article. I don't think these are unusual or exceptional in any way. I think if the authors were aware that I was arguing with their points, they would be surprised and perhaps even taken aback. And I'm not saying any of this to pick a fight. I'm saying this because I think it is an important part of the intellectual questioning of something that is taken as axiomatic. And so this brings me to the question of what is risk. And I want to mention that I'm collaborating with Shannon Lancy on some of this, and none of this represents her. But I want to credit her for contributing to my thinking and helping advance my thinking. So what is risk? First, risk is not a physical property. There is no riskometer in the sense of a thermometer. Um, Risk doesn't derive from physical units in the sense of like force equals mass times acceleration. There are, of course, physical risks, like a bridge has some risk of collapse. Constructs like investment portfolios have risk. But risk is absolutely a concept that we regularly use in an awful lot of related but different ways. So the word risk comes from the old Italian riscar, which means to dare, venture, or gamble in the sense of nothing ventured, nothing gained. I'm not going to subject anyone here to my Italian pronunciation. And the word is often used to mean danger. So, despite risks posed by threats to its use of systems, we're talking about danger. And it often implies quantification. I think of risk, especially when people ask me this as we're threat modeling. I say a risk is a threat, the possibility of a future problem, with quantified likelihood and impact. And it's that quantification of likelihood and impact that I think transforms something from a general threat to a specific risk. And if you have not seen this, this is the parachute for one of the Mars rovers that is currently operating. And included in the parachute is JPL's motto, which is to dare greatly. And so I thought that was another fun little joke for them. So, does managing risk depend on measuring risk? And there are lots of famous people who have said things along the lines of you can't manage what you don't measure. And okay, let's take all of these smart people. I mean, Lord Kelvin, for goodness sakes, Lord Kelvin was clearly smarter than I am. So he's probably right. So if we're going to measure risk, I want to recommend this fantastic book by Peter Bernstein, who talks about the history of risk measurement. And, excuse me. Sorry. So, a lot of the history of risk measurement comes from insuring ships at sea. Merchants wanted to spread um, the financial impact of a ship being lost at sea, which was a common occurrence. And so, measuring and assessing the likelihood that a ship would be lost allowed coalitions to price the cost of insurance in case the ship was lost. And the better you were at predicting the likelihood a ship would be lost, the less you could charge for insurance while still making a profit. And so there's a nice business use case for measuring risk. And the first big mathematical thinking around questions of risk involved some of the most famous mathematicians in history. Pascal, Fermat of Fermat's last theorem, worked on this problem of the interrupted game. And the interrupted game is a set of people are gambling, there's money in the pot, one of them is ahead, and the game is interrupted by something important. How should the pot be fairly divided up? And Pascal, Fermat, and many other famous mathematicians spent months of correspondence engaging with this question and designing things like Pascal's triangle, which is still used in risk management today. Another place where risk measurement is used or was used a lot, still is used a lot, were annuities and pension plans. And these have a slightly different meaning than you might think. which is the government of Great Britain and the government of the Netherlands financed themselves for a long time by selling pension plans to their citizens. And to the extent that they were good at estimating the length of life for someone who's, say, 30 years old now, how long will they live? Those pension plans were a good bet for the government. And to the extent that they were not good at it, they could go bankrupt as a result. And so calculating that risk was a tremendously important use case for a long time. And then, somewhat obviously, stock portfolios. We measure risk around stock portfolios. At NASA, there's a whole debate over what's called design versus statistics. And I take this term from this article by Trudy Bell and Carl Esch on the Challenger disaster, in which they talk about, is this a mathematical problem or is it an engineering problem? And Feynman, in his personal observations on the reliability of shuttle, opens by saying estimates of the risk of loss of a vehicle ranged from 1 in 100 to 1 in 100,000. And he has some very, very blunt words about what it means to have a 1,000-fold difference in the estimate of risk and what that should have meant to managers of the shuttle program. There's also work which might be of interest if you're interested in how a major government agency does this. Failure mode effects and analysis actually has a lot of intellectual contributions to the work that we now do in threat modeling. Work on STAMP by Nancy Leveson and company is important. And NASA also uses a system of tech readiness levels. And their tech readiness levels range from 1 to 9, and this is a fairly famous restatement of what they mean. At tech readiness level 1, no one's done any engineering work, and we ask, what if there are unicorns? We progress through, we've drawn a unicorn, through we've placed a horse in our lab, etc., etc. And as the technology is proven through use that at least it can work once, it goes up in readiness levels and it is reused across many missions. And so this is an interestingly non-statistical approach to risk management. But the overarching thing, the reason I walk through these various approaches to risk measurement is all of them are fundamentally driven by iteration. That by doing an experiment over and over again, or measuring how often phenomena happen in some space, we can assess things based on those many tests. And one of the examples, actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this. But I will talk about this. So the Europa Clipper mission, which just launched, had a set of issues where a manufacturing change in the MOSFETs, which are a type of transistor, was discovered late, and nobody knows what that means for the mission. And what they did was they put this thing called a canary box on it. It's a literal box with a set of these MOSFETs in it, each of which has a unique circuit that allows it to be independently tested. Okay, that's cool. And the official NASA blog refers to this as risk of using these parts on the Europa Clipper spacecraft. I don't actually know what they mean by risk here, right? We don't necessarily have probability. The impact is some parts of the spacecraft will suddenly start working or suddenly stop working. And what they're doing, they've got some very cool engineering fixes which involve heating and annealing to extend the life of these MOSFETs. And that feels like what I would call risk mitigation. Except when I actually look at definitions of risk, it doesn't seem quite so much like it complies with the more specific definitions of risk mitigation that we talk about. It seems very hard to quantify these risks, even with that canary box. And so, I believe that we should treat risk management techniques as hypotheses, not axioms. We should not go with the risk management is something we do. We should say risk management could be something we do. And if we do it, we should measure the properties of the systems that we're working with. Two of the properties we might think about are precision and accuracy. And accuracy is how close measures are to the truth, while precision is how close they are to each other. And so in this graph here, on the vertical axes, we have increasing accuracy. The little red dots are getting closer to the target, to the center of the target. And on the horizontal axis, we have increasing precision. And so at the bottom right at 4 o'clock, you see a precisely grouped set of red dots, but they are not accurate. And it is only when we have both precision and accuracy that our measures are tightly grouped at the target. And these are measurable properties. These are things we can think about measuring with a risk management toolkit, for a risk management toolkit, or for multiple risk management toolkits. So another property that we have is uncertainty. These are inputs that are not known. So sometimes, we have an input that is not known, but someone might look it up. This might be, how likely is that 30-year-old to live to be 60? I have no idea what the answer is, but there are tables that let me figure it out. But there are also inputs that are radically uncertain. And what Kay and King talk about is places where it's a result of vagueness, ambiguity, or, and I think this is really important, a lack of information that in some cases, but not all, we might hope to rectify. And so there's things that we can learn, right? If we were to launch a bunch of Europa Clipper missions, we would learn something that reduces the uncertainty of that mission. If we launch multiple missions to the moon, we reduce the risk by reducing uncertainty by demonstrating that it's worked once, twice, or even 3 times. And from a cybersecurity perspective, I think that adaptive behavior by attackers seems somewhat different than uncertain. It's not a lack of information that we might hope to rectify. It's human unpredictability or even orneriness or even the core of adversarial behavior, which is that the attacker seeks to do something unexpected to maximize their advantage. There's a property that risk management systems have, which is sensitivity. How much a change in the input influences the results. And this helps us understand the reliability of a conclusion. It helps us identify how to control a system, how to manage its outputs, and it helps us focus our empirical studies. Does answering this question change our answer in some way? If not, and there are lots of unknowns to which the system is just not really sensitive. And so if the system isn't sensitive to this unknown, it's not worth a lot of energy to reduce uncertainty. So, some things we could do scientifically. We could look at the precision of a given risk management technique. We could have many people quantify some risk. We could measure reliability, either between the people who are doing it or even between the same people doing the same task multiple times with time in between. One of the fascinating things I've learned by looking at medical risk management is is that there's a lot of places in which doctors, given the same weird set of symptoms, will provide different outputs if you ask them a couple of months apart. And so that's intra-rater reliability, and we can measure the spread. And one of the fun things about doing things with humans is your differences might not be independent. We might not get to a normal distribution. But one of the fun things about measuring precision is we can measure it without knowing a real value. We can see whether or not people are precise without knowing whether or not they're accurate. And accuracy, I think requires iterations. And I've got a question mark here because I'm just not sure. But every failure gives you data, and failures might be really, really expensive. And this is a property of space missions, is having your space mission fail is really expensive. Um, and outside of that, near misses give us data. For a long time, I've been an advocate of using near miss data to inform our understanding of security incidents and security problems. Another property that risk management systems have is cost. Doing work has a cost. It's the effort to produce the measurement, it's the effort to justify the measurement, it's the record keeping, it's the vigorous debate to which NASA was referring. And that debate may even add some value, right? We might get smarter about either likelihood, impact, or mitigation via vigorous debate. But we shouldn't assume that that debate is free. That debate has a cost, at least in people's time, maybe even in their emotional relationship with each other. And that cost relates to return on investment. Return on investment is one of those things that's easy to write about. What's the return on investment of risk management is, I think, a little harder, but I do think cost is a property we can study. And so we can think about managing cost. And if work is either expensive or unreliable, do it once. And so, for example, what is an acceptable rate for phishing tests to fail at? There's been some great work. Some of the folks I know at UC San Diego have done a really interesting paper on phishing failure rates. There's a lot of good work, but what's acceptable is a question that companies ask me every day. Is it acceptable to have 5% of our employees failing our phishing tests? You know, I don't know, and neither do they. But the work of figuring it out is expensive and unreliable, and I think we ought to do it once. I think NIST ought to answer that question, pick a number, and say this is a justifiable number that everyone can simply rely on. And again, my consulting experience is every company goes ahead and tries to answer it. And let me just admit, the table is going to be wrong, but it's not going to be any more wrong or any less wrong because 2 or 3 different companies do the work. One of them will get it closer to right, the other will get it further. And if we're transparent about the methodology, maybe Maybe some company does have better answers for some reason and can make use of those. But if we give people permission to use standard answers that we accept are wrong, but they're acceptable, we save everyone a lot of money. So where does that lead us? I think, and I appreciate all of you holding questions to the end. I'm going to finish in just a minute. I really think there's a bunch of fascinating research topics for you here. So we might start to measure risk management approaches. I think there's a bunch of PhDs right here on this slide in terms of measuring precision and cost. I think there's questions of why, how unsatisfying is that really? Why is it unsatisfying? To whom is it unsatisfying? And are we comparing real risk management systems to aspirational ones? Are we, to use a commonplace again, allowing the best to be the enemy of the good? If we stop treating risk management as axiomatic, we can start treating it as hypotheses. So we might have two approaches. The green approach will result in precision of 85% at a cost of $5,000 per estimation, and we'll have a 3-year retrospective predictive accuracy of 25%. Maybe we've got another approach that has a precision of 60%. But the cost is only $1,000 per estimation, and maybe we'll have a predictive accuracy of 15%. Now, I have chosen these numbers to be provocative, but I don't think they're necessarily wrong. I think an awful lot of the methodologies that we see in use today might have accuracies on the order of 15 to 25%. In terms of if it predicts one of these, if you do 6 predictions and each comes out as saying 1 in 6 of these things will happen, we'll get 1 or 2 in 6. I'd be surprised to see that. I think it's worth measuring. I think it's worth exploring. We can also think about tech readiness levels. We could think about cyber risk management as technology and say each specific approach has a readiness level. Or we could say that risk management itself could be treated as a thing subject to technology readiness levels, tested under these conditions but not those. And I think there are a lot of other possibilities, but in conclusion, I want to jump back up to the 50,000-foot level. I want to say asking why do we believe that is a really good research strategy. Sometimes you will find yourself coming to good answers, and what you have just done is a literature survey. In other times, you will find yourself coming to open questions that are the subject of real advanced research. I do think it is important that we ask, is risk management as helpful as we hope? And I'd like to mention that threat modeling techniques like the 4-question frame are actually designed to help independently of these questions. I think they allow us to answer the question of how do we practically make this thing more secure. And that is useful. But I hope over the next years, you all will make it even more useful by doing some important research. So with that, I should mention the little unicorn here. I asked an LLM for a American astronaut space unicorn, and I especially loved that the helmet that it drew couldn't even fit over the unicorn horn, which I thought was just a phenomenal representation of the concept of technology readiness levels, and so decided to leave it in. With that, there are no questions in the Q&A. Either I was very boring or I was way less provocative than I hoped to be, and I apologize in either event.
I think you were interesting and provocative,
Oh, thank you.
but there's a lot there to think about and unpack. Um, so let me ask the attendees if you have a question or a comment, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post it, and we'll use that. Just because it's the most recent thing on the screen, I love that unicorn picture, uh, especially the fact that the horn has a twist to it, um, which I sort of wonder where the data comes from to have that twist with uneven growth. Um, but I'm overthinking that particular picture for what you have here. Um,
While we're overthinking it, the other thing I'm going to point out, just to give people a chance to type some questions, is the really astounding American flag
yes,
with the stars in the middle of the stripes. I don't even know what that is.
it is. Yeah. Um, well, I did want to ask something. I had a little side conversation with Steve in the chat here while you were talking. Um, that our notion of risk or sources of risk have undergone changes. Some have been gradual and some have been rather seismic, going, for instance, from mainframes to networks to clouds. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to how the nature of risk as we evaluate it, or the questions we even ask about it, change as we make a transition from our more or less deterministic computing model to one that is really sort of fundamentally stochastic when we start using AI systems or quantum
Ooh.
systems. Um, so in the spirit of being provocative, any comments on that?
Yeah, so let me answer the middle part. I think the cloud is a really interesting set of shifts of risk. On the one hand, we create and actually, let me use the term danger before I use the term risk. Um, on the one hand, we add the danger that the cloud operator will mess things up or be penetrated at scale. And so that's a really important set of dangers. On the other hand, one of the things that cloud providers have done, which is really exciting, is they've changed the operating system level affordances. So when you have a side effect free function like an AWS Lambda, you can no longer rely on the computer being the same computer that one Lambda runs on and then the next one runs on. And so you have to start putting your data rather than in local files, you have to put it into some storage system which can be permissioned and managed in a different way than local storage was managed. And so I think we've got increased danger from the environment, but also a decrease because we've got these new boundaries. And I do not know the other big difference that I think is there is, well, we have the possibility that the cloud provider will mess up. We also had the possibility that our data center operations team would mess up. And I think it's very hard to assess which of those is more likely, in a way that makes it, I don't know how to use risk to think about that in a way that helps me answer the question of should I move to the cloud? And
Mhm.
with that, did I answer your question?
Part of it, the bit about AI and quantum would require considerably more here, but we've got questions from the audience that I think take those first and we can come back if need be.
Sure. So Ali Al-Haj is asking, if risk management is not always the right thing to do, what other options can we use instead? And I think my first answer is don't attempt to quantify. To the extent that quantification is hard and unreliable, don't do it. Select a set of things which you want to do for whatever reasons make sense and work on those. The second, and this is a longer term option, is we can do science. We can say we don't know the answer, but there's a if we believe, actually, I'm going to flip this around a little bit. If we don't know, your question reads, if risk management is not always the right thing to do, what other options can we use? I'm going to flip your question and ask, if we don't have a reason to believe that risk management or this particular risk management thing is the right thing to do, why on earth would we do it? And the reason I put it like that is because it frees us up to start exploring the option space. And I think that option space is very important. With the next question here from Andrew is, how does one best account for nth party risk, the risk from a vendor or the librarian in SBOM? This is a great question, and I was on a call this morning in which we spent a lot of time talking about how we do this, and the healthcare organizations on the call didn't even know all of the dependencies they had. They were a little bit far from the question of how do we quantify the risk. And so we actually spent a lot, hours thinking through the question of how do they do this without ever getting to what I might call impact. No, we did get to impact. We didn't get to likelihood very much. And so the thing I want to mention for both of these questions is there aren't good answers today. And it's easy for us, it's easy to say, okay, this is the thing that will allow me to do the work and justify it to some set of people around me. But I think when we put on our academic hats, it's worth thinking about what better ways do we have to answer these. Spaff, I saw a thing that said you were going to answer one of those live as well. Did you want to jump in with some perspective?
No, I was just clearing those so that you had answered them and tidy up.
Got it.
There's another one there.
So, hi, Shannon. Nice to have you here. And Shannon says, I want to say one option to replace risk management is threat modeling. For many values of replace, yes, I agree. That the thing that we are not yet doing that I think people think is important with risk management is the quantification aspect. And one of my goals in giving this talk is to question how much we need that quantification aspect. But I think today there is an implicit expectation that it be there. And part of the reason I chose this talk for CERIAS is because I think that assumption, the very title of the talk, which is Risk is Not Axiomatic, is an invitation to more research and more analysis and to determine whether or not threat modeling replaces risk management. And you're adding another comment, which is we need to know, did we do a good enough job? And that replaces quantification. And I think you may well be right, but I think you may be in the minority well being right. And that makes life difficult for, say, the medical device makers that we both work with, or for the healthcare organizations that we both work with, and where they're being asked by sector risk management agencies to do risk management as a result of things that Congress has charged them with doing. I'd like to improve what those things are, and I think that that's going to take some time.
I think one of the things you bring up here, which is interesting about quantification, whether it's axiomatic or otherwise, and even if it's probabilistic, um, we may be seeking too fine a point, given the unknowns involved, that with a lot of metrics, sometimes just the simple Likert scale is sufficient for investment or for decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And that it is probably worth looking at some of these. I think general in science is when you're talking about the level of measurement, the level of precision in measurement, it should be a question of, well, what is, as you said, what is good enough, is an important question that is not often asked. We seek to put more digits after the decimal point without ever really needing it, is an issue. Well,
I'm remembering a thing that I did once, which, well, I'm allowed to talk about this. When I was fixing auto run, one of the challenges that we ran into was there was a belief that auto run was in use by a lot of systems. And so people wanted quantification of the harm that was caused by it. And there were a lot of questions of was our quantification good enough? Was it precise enough? Was it accurate enough? Because we had some estimates of how much it was going to cost, both for ourselves in terms of support and for our customers who had to change the way they did things. And so we knew something about the costs. We knew something about the cost on one side of the equation, and people kept wanting more as a way of, well, I don't want to talk about their motivations, but they wanted more before they'd make a decision. And that desire for more data as we're trying to make decisions, or more accuracy, more precision, I think is something that goes unquestioned.
I think that is a great point to end on. Maybe not the best point, but a great point. It is wonderful to have had you here visiting with us today and speaking. I would thank everybody in the audience for attending, and keep in mind we have another talk next Wednesday that will also provide some stimulating questions and ideas. As always, great to see you, and I wish everybody a pleasant remainder of your day.
Great to see you. Thank you very much.
Bye all.